What's up, everyone? Andrew here. Welcome back to Nine Leaders. And today I've got a fascinating discussion with a returning guest, Dr. Morne Mostert, who needs no introduction. He is the commissioner for the presidency of South Africa in terms of the National Planning Commission, a world-renowned speaker on strategy and development and futures thinking. And he's got some exciting developments specifically around the area of leadership, which obviously is a huge focus for us at Nine Leaders here. What I really love about this conversation is he talks us through a new instrument that he's using for leadership development, specifically around mindset and how the mindset and worldview can really impact both leaders, people, business, decision making, and it's a fascinating discussion that I've got in store for you. What's really exciting about this, obviously, is this lines up with our vision at Nine Leaders, is to equip new and experienced leaders with the skills required to lead in a new world, and specifically look at, are the old frameworks really applicable in this new world, or do we need to create some shape and form of new leadership thinking? So this is Dr. Morne Mostert. Dr. Morne Mostert, welcome back to Nine Leaders. It's great to see you and have you on the show again. It's been 18 months since we last chatted. A lot has taken place, a lot has changed. But firstly, how are you keeping? How are you doing? What's happening in the world of Dr. Morne Mostert?
Andrew, great to see you. And yeah, lots have changed, not just for me, but for many people all around the world. I've decided really to go back into strategic foresight advisory services. Lots of work I did before my stint at the Institute for Futures Research, where I am retained as a strategic foresight advisor, spending much more of my time on international strategy advisory space.
Fantastic. And the working with the presidency, I believe, it's exciting.
That's right.
The country's in good hands now, I take it.
Yeah, it was a fantastic surprise and honor, Andrew, to get the call from the president to serve as a commissioner in the National Planning Commission. South Africa is at a very interesting juncture in its life cycle, and a fantastic opportunity to make a contribution to the nation in this way.
That's brilliant. Congratulations. And yeah, like I said, I'm fully confident that the country is in good hands, knowing that you've got a part of that planning, especially for the work that I've seen you doing in the past. We obviously 18 months ago we chatted, and that discussion was really around the future of South Africa, the future of Africa, and your work with the Club of Rome. I wanted to see now, what has been your take from then till now, 18 months ago? We spoke a lot about the industrialization of Africa and all the challenges that are potentially facing. Where do you stand now? What have you seen over the last 18 months? Are you still as positive as you were then? And obviously being part of the Planning Commission, you have to be positive in some shape or form. But what has been your takeouts for the last 18 months? How things have changed, how things have improved, or perhaps gone backwards in some shape or form?
Yeah, Andrew, from a futurist perspective, I have to say, firstly, that the way we look at the world, both optimism and pessimism are forms of cognitive bias. If you're overly optimistic, you can miss some of the risks. If you're overly dystopian, you can miss some of the opportunities. I think, in all fairness, COVID has hit both South Africa and the rest of Africa enormously hard. The resilience that we were hoping for really just hasn't been there. The issues I found really interesting is how we started featuring science at the early stage of the pandemic. Really became fascinating to see people on television talk about science again. I think the last time I saw that was beyond 2000 in my teenage years. But to have scientists on the public platforms in the public domain talking science was fantastic to see. I think it gave a globalized perspective. It got rid of that little bit of exceptionalism, and I think it did introduce a very interesting quality of the dialogue. What was fascinating, though, is, and I haven't seen too many people talk about this, is this emerging tension between the health sciences and the economic sciences. And when people in many parts of Africa said, well, we should follow the science,
Which
what they
science?
were referring to exactly was in fact the health science. And we saw the World Health Organization commend many parts of Africa on how amazing they were in securing a lockdown.
Mm.
Well, from a futurist perspective, of course, we know it's all systemic. And what's so paradoxical is the long-term scarring from an economic science perspective, that large parts of the South African population and the rest of Africa will unfortunately suffer as a result of this lockdown. Obviously easy in retrospect to reflect, but it's clear to us that our emergency response, and there have been some other emergencies in South Africa and in other parts of Africa, our emergency response really lacks a strategic approach. It lacks an agility, and the early warning systems and emergency response quality, I think, well, one hopes, I should say, will be vastly improved as we see all over the world, as we might from a Club of Rome perspective, an increase in both the frequency of disruption as well as the severity of disruption. And so emergency response, including early warning systems, I think will become absolutely essential in the way that Africa deals with these kinds of disruptions in the longer term.
100%. I think just hearing you say that, I often travel to Asia. It's my favorite destination. And whether it's Bali, Thailand, Japan, wherever you might be, they've got those, because of the frequency of things like tsunamis and earthquakes, they're very geared towards that. You see signs all over the place. And it's a day-to-day concern. With something like this, with a pandemic, it pretty much caught everybody unaware. There were people talking about it for years and years and years and sending warning signs, but the severity and the globalization of something like this was almost took everybody on the back foot. Do you think that this is going to actually have got us prepared and improved our preparations? Should something like this happen again? It might be a silly question, but has it actually been that wake up to go, actually something like this could happen, and we need to have those plans in place?
I think we can expect to see those kinds of responses in the medium to longer term. At the moment, my sense is that many societies are simply reeling from the hit they took as a result of COVID. So there's a consciousness that we need to work on some of these issues, but in reality, the day-to-day experience of millions and millions of people across the continent is simply that they've been hit by the economic impact of COVID. And it will take a number of years for us, I would say, to come close to the kind of levels where we were before COVID, which, let's face it, were not all that desirable. So a consciousness of these methods, but the reality is working our way out. And here I should emphasize and echo perhaps some of the sentiments in our last discussion, that we're realizing just once again that generic economic averages such as GDP and GDP per person really just do not tell the story of people on the ground. So you might see in headline numbers a recovery for certain companies, and in headline numbers a recovery for certain economies based on these broad general number crunching kind of approaches like GDP. But the reality for the vast majority of people, in fact, is that it's going to take a long time to recover.
Absolutely. And in terms of that, it's going, right, well, how as leadership do we prepare for that? And I think that's really one of the major discussions we want to chat through today, the exciting endeavors that you've got in play. Just coming back to South Africa perspective very quickly, with regards to obviously your position now, in terms of the planning, the presidency and all of that. And please, you can tell me if you can't answer this. I fully understand. But obviously government has been calling for a very long time for the closer working relationships between the private sector and government. And COVID has now sort of exasperated that, where communities are going, well, we can't necessarily rely on basic services, whether it's medical services, whether it's power. Obviously, we're going through at the moment quite a challenging time from a power perspective in South Africa. And you start to see these smaller communities that are actually taking ownership of their own resources. And Stellenbosch, we know that from a connectivity side of things, they're also talking about going off the grid completely. Other places, my hometown in the Eastern Cape, the old Queenstown, the New Kimani, even the fire brigade is done by volunteers. So it's really about the community taking ownership of their own environment. Is that as a result? Do you think that's is that it's obviously to a large degree it's enforced that people have to take ownership of themselves? From a long-term perspective, though, is that a good thing or a bad thing that smaller communities are going, well, actually, we don't need to rely on government and we can sort of just do our own thing? Is that, from a futures perspective, going, well, does that lead to inclusivity? Does that lead to working together closer? Or is it a little bit of a separation of community and state, if I can put it that way?
Gosh, it's so fascinating, isn't it? I think the first thing we always look for is there a signal here? Is this symbolizing a significant shift? And I do think that there is an awakening realization that a complete reliance on government was in fact never a good idea. That's irrespective of who the government is. To place your bet entirely on the government and rely so heavily on the quality of decision-making in government was perhaps never a good idea. But I would say that about any country on earth.
Yeah.
The next thing to say is that it is heartening, isn't it, that we have this resilience in the citizenry, that despite these hits that we all took, there are nevertheless citizens with this astonishing ability to bounce back and to say, look, I'll take action in my community. And I think that speaks very well of a kind of South African national resilience. You know, South Africa has taken a number of hits over many decades, and we've somehow managed to come back. I would caution, though, against the sustainability of this approach and, in fact, the ethics from a governance perspective. So from a sustainability perspective, you have to say, well, this has to be funded somewhere. And I don't think that it is financially sustainable for citizens to fund this either through their efforts, their time, or financial investment. And then ethically, I would say that if the government makes promises that it will deliver on these services, that in fact it has to keep those promises, that it cannot abdicate that responsibility by arguing that citizens are now picking up some of the slack here. So a fantastic gesture of collaboration among citizens themselves and a national resilience. In the longer term, though, not a perfect model. What I would say just finally on this is there is perhaps an opportunity for government to think differently about the disbursement of funds for local management. It was part of the philosophy behind the 3 tiers of government, which, let's be honest, hasn't really panned out at so many municipalities in the way that we thought. But an interesting financial model may be emerging here that says, how could we fund hyper-local citizen groups to deliver, at least in the interim, on some of the crisis needs citizens have?
Absolutely. And again, it's that inclusivity of empowering a citizenry to be able to take ownership of their own lives and not just reliant on government, but also having a government that is going, well, this is what we can do, this is what and creating the structures that are actually working for us. All of what you've spoken about now really does come down to the leadership element of the quality of decision making, the quality of leaders that we have. And this is not just a South African statement, but it's pretty much a global. Coming in that leadership space, I see a huge opportunity on a couple levels for leadership. Not only the depth and breadth of leadership, but the wisdom that needs to come alongside. It's all well and good having an MBA or being educated to the nines, but really bringing it through that wisdom element. And the second element there that is opportunity, rather, is from an African perspective, if we look at the statistics with regards to population growth and the amount of the population or percentage of populations that's going to be considered as youth by 2030, there's a huge opportunity there to be able to invest in leadership and young leaders to be able to take on the future. You've come up with something very, very exciting. You've been part of developing a very interesting instrument that I wanted to dive into to really understand the why and all of that. And that's the Leadership and Mindset Index that you're releasing. Talk us through a little bit around, firstly, what's the purpose? Why have you identified this as an opportunity with this assessment, this index? What's the thinking behind it? Why have you gone down this road?
Gosh, Andrew, the main reason is really my curiosity about these mega shifts all around the world, and then the ability of leaders to make complex decisions given these mega shifts. So it's really born out of the idea that we know, as I indicated earlier, that both the frequency and the severity of disruption are increasing. So the question is, what does this mean for the way that leaders make decisions? And part of the answer to that lies in what one might call their paradigms, almost a cliché, frequent word for futurists, their patterns, their models of thinking, their mental models, their mindsets, if you like. So the origin of this is really this work I've done all around the world. Been very lucky to do that in 11 or 12 African countries, a lot of it in the Middle East, much of it in Europe, in Paris, London, and Rome, and Geneva, and so on, occasionally in Azerbaijan. And what would be so fascinating to me in facilitating these strategic foresight sessions is inevitably a kind of debate would break out among the leaders in the room. And some people would say, well, you know, this is the approach we should have as a businesses in the society. And then someone else would say, no, this I think is a viable alternative. Then someone would say, well, this is what an investor is. And someone would say, no, that's the role of an investor, or whatever stakeholder that might be. This is a talented person. No, this is how I see talent. Or, you know, this is the kind of product and service portfolio we should be designing for society. No, it should be based on, let's say, you know, shareholder value or whatever the case. In other words, all over the world, I started seeing that there were these distinct mindsets that emerged when these bigger issues had to be addressed. We know the world is, for example, globalizing. And what's happening is that leaders are being confronted much more frequently and with much greater severity with an explosive diversity of mindsets. If you think about how businesses worked 100 years ago, typically people working in the business would be more or less the same kind of people, from a similar background, speaking a similar language, often a similar religion, a similar philosophical bent. You walk into any multinational organization now, and it is a festival of mindsets, philosophies, paradigms, and mental models. And so with some colleagues, I set about developing an instrument that could help senior leaders to do really two things. Firstly, to gain an insight into their own mindsets. And here, Andrew, I just want to emphasize, I know there are many other instruments available on the market. I was an advisor to a national psychometrics company for over a decade. And there we used a whole battery of some of the best practice assessments from all around the world. And there is everything your heart could desire, from emotional intelligence to even intellect, to personality, to values, to a whole host of other dimensions. What I always missed was, is there a way for us to discover something about how people fundamentally interpret the world around them from a philosophical perspective? In other words, what do you fundamentally believe about how the universe is put together? And then secondly, to take that mindset, once leaders are more self-aware on their own mindsets, their own paradigms, philosophies, to take that awareness into the strategic thinking domain, where I spend most of my time. Right. And to say, what are the implications of our mindset given the strategic intent we have? And in fact, the The risk of not doing it is clear to see. With globalization, for example, we see so many companies going into, let's say, the rest of Africa. And 9 months later, having launched in the first week with doves and sandwiches and T-shirts and half-naked acrobats at the local convention center, 9 months later, there's a terrible fine. And 18 months later, they run away with their tails between their legs. And this has happened not just in the rest of Africa, but in so many cases where so-called developing economies are the target for so-called developed economies. Expat teams fly in, copy and paste models and spreadsheets, and very little attention is paid to the way that people, in fact, think about the way the whole world is put together and therefore the way they make decisions.
Yeah, one of my favorite authors is James Clavell with his Asian saga. I mentioned Asia previously, but his Asian saga, and it's just really from a cultural perspective, he goes very deep into understanding the Asian business mindset and the Western business mindset, and the sometimes neither the two shall meet at times, and at other times it really works well. So this assessment, effectively, it's correct me if I'm wrong, it's a battery of questions that an individual leader would answer on themselves. Is there any external, so because it's mindset, it's purely how do I see the world, what is my world view based on these number of questions that are asked? Am I on the right track?
Correct. So it is what we call ipsative in the assessment world. So it is self-reporting, but there is an opportunity to turn this into a 360. Really, the key benefit lies in understanding your own belief system, which is something that you cannot get from understanding how much EQ you have or how bright you are. I think what comes perhaps closest is the idea of values, and there are some interesting assessments for that. There's the World Value Survey. There are a number of instruments here. In our research, what we found is that values sit really on top of belief systems. That values are the expression of belief systems.
Yeah.
If you think about how many companies go through a process, perhaps of a climate survey, and that in 99.9% of the cases, the findings, irrespective of the company you're in, are exactly the same. Yeah. Number one, I don't think my salary is quite high enough. HR then responds with a salary survey and benchmarking. Number two, the environment is a little bit stressed. HR then responds with some kind of wellness intervention. Number three, transparency is lacking in the communication system. Yeah. HR then responds with let's train managers on how to do it. And so the list goes on. The culture should be more fun, and it should be clearer how I can get a promotion or get a salary increase or get a 100% bonus. And that list you find, almost irrespective of where the company is in the world or how big it is.
Yeah.
So if that's true, then you have to wonder, well, what's the point of asking the question if you're going to get back the same answer from all these other companies? So to me, it would be much more interesting to say, well, what is behind this behavior? So this assessment is not behavioral. Mm-hmm. It's not emotional. It's not even an assessment of intellectual capacity. It is an evaluation and an articulation of the fundamental belief system that you have. And if you think about how belief systems play out around the world currently, Andrew, look at the Middle East, where I spent a lot of time.
Yeah.
Look at the Trumpsters versus the rest. Look at Brexit. Look at Putin versus Zelensky. You see these enormous contestations of mindsets, irrespective, as you indicated earlier, of technical competence, managing the spreadsheet and calculating the ROI and all the rest of it. Irrespective of those competencies, sometimes irrespective of emotional intelligence, a clash, a global contestation of mindsets. And I would say if you're sitting at the upper echelons of a large organization that has a global purview, if you're making strategic decisions without insight into mindset, you're really driving blind, and you're putting your stakeholders, your investors, your shareholders, your talent, your suppliers and staff at risk.
Right. What I'm hearing you say also, and again, I work with a number of tools, especially what like you mentioned now around communication, teamwork, understanding the climate of business. And one of the tools which sounds very similar to what you're talking about from a worldview perspective, but speaks more towards the base motivation or core fear, perhaps, that are driven from an individual psyche. So it's exciting that it's now moving into that leadership space. Is there room in terms of going from that individual worldview to making strategic decisions of saying, right, as an individual, I'm taking this assessment, understanding, getting a clear picture of what my worldview is, and then using it with my team, my senior executive team, going, right, okay, let's all get a base point for how we all view the world. And then from there going, right, contextually, how do we make strategic decisions based on that? Is that where it's sort of going? Is that right?
Exactly correct. Exactly correct. So, and this is in fact what we're doing with clients at the moment. That people are also interested in what's the worldview of my colleagues. How do they see the world? Think about, I won't mention any names, everyone will be familiar, spectacular blowouts of executives in boardrooms in South Africa and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
That lead to millions and millions of dollars in court cases and vast damage in the reputation of the organization. People muddle along, they have a sense of discomfort. Maybe it's a diversity issue, maybe I'm just not the right fit. And then there's a sudden blowout, and it's extremely expensive from a decision-making perspective. So you're absolutely right. If you can get some insight into the mindset of your colleagues, you can then get, as many assessments do, except not in this subject, you can get a profile of the mindset of the leadership team, for example. You can then contrast that mindset profile with the mindset of people in the business, of the mindset of investors and other shareholders, of the mindset of your talent, and very interesting to me from a strategy perspective, the mindset, for example, of a target customer segment, and the way that they may think about the world, what they believe about the world. And this is beyond kind of learning cultural customs around eye contact or handshakes or which direction to point your toes in. This is about a deep appreciation of the way that different people, as we've all known since forever, different people believe different things. What is the impact of that on the way that you make a decision? That's what we're curious about.
That's very exciting. What has been sort of the, I want to come back to something that you highlighted earlier, is how this came about in terms of the actual questions. So what is sort of the methodology that you use to create the battery of questions? Where did that sort of stem from?
Well, the best answer I have for you is it comes from practice. It comes from standing in that boardroom somewhere in Azerbaijan or Paris and seeing this debate, reaching a point where it's on the verge of a fist fight about how people think differently about fundamental issues. Now, the birth, therefore, is in practice. It's not just a little conceptual thing I came up with and wrote some notes down. But what I did realize is doing all this work around the world is there would be patterns. So whether it's Geneva or Abu Dhabi, you'd see a similar contestation. And so I started from practice, really kind of living theory approach, recording some of these key philosophical constructs, and eventually had a kind of what we call a bricolage collection of 48 of these. Now, of course, that's a little bit overwhelming. And then we realized with some colleagues, especially in the industrial psychology, that many of these, almost all of these, operate on a scale. It turns out you kind of lean one way or you lean another. It's not binary. So we're not trying to box you. We're not trying to say you're one or the other, but you have a philosophical bent. And we realized that we could create 24 of these continua, where you either lean one way or lean another. Let me give you just one example. Voluntarism and determinism comes up 101 out of 100 times. Voluntarists are all about choice. They believe people do choose, they can choose, they must choose. Determinists essentially believe that people are largely the output, the product of their environment.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are two fundamentally different worldviews. When they clash, it is staggering what the consequences would be, not only for interacting with your colleagues and your other stakeholders, as I mentioned, but also for the way that you design products. So let's imagine, as so many classical Western senior people are, that you have a voluntarist mindset. You believe people choose, they can choose, and they must choose. And you design a product offering in which the customer can choose and should choose and must choose. But the customer segment is a little bit more deterministic. They want a little bit more guidance. They feel themselves compelled to respond to their environment. They feel essentially driven by the context. You can see there's no value judgment here.
Yeah.
We're not deciding one is right and one is not. But what we are saying is that if you don't understand that distinction, and we've had a client who's done exactly that, then you design a product portfolio based on a certain philosophy. If you're not conscious of that, you can't get that from an EQ test or from a personality assessment. If you're not conscious of the belief system, you can then design products essentially for yourself. And of course, we all know it's the stakeholders that have to engage with it. So just to respond quickly to your answer then on the architecture of the issue of the assessment, these 24 polar dimensions with these 48 constructs, which we then realized could be organized in 7 domains, which I can talk about if you want. And then we had to make sure that there was a scientific validity around this.
Yeah.
And the balance to strike here, as you well know, Andrew, is between you want to make the things scientifically valid on the one hand, and you don't want to ask 3,000 questions and get people to spend a week on this because it won't work. So ultimately, we landed on around 168 questions, and we subjected this to quite severe statistical validation and reliability testing. We've done a safe pilot with a number of people who are willing to volunteer, and we're now at a stage where we just launched quite recently to people with interest from over 33 countries. I was really astonished.
Fantastic.
By the interest there, and we have an instrument now that I think, in the best intention, makes a contribution to the world in the sense that it helps us as humanity to understand that people believe different things. We've always known that. Now we have an instrument that gives us a little bit of granular insight.
Fantastic. The uptake that you've spoken about now, coming from 33 countries, at what level do you sort of find the biggest uptake? Is it at the very senior head of global corporations that are taking up? Is it at that middle section? Because again, we talk about that the dichotomy of new leaders versus experienced leaders, and then the squeeze of middle management.
Yeah.
Where are you finding the biggest uptake in this?
We see 2 groups that are showing interest. Your suspicions are quite correct that we find towards the upper echelons, people have a greater consciousness of the implications this could have. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, the more senior you become, the greater the impact of your decision making.
Yeah.
You have access to, you're really acting on behalf of the shareholders with their resources. And so the sways of impact you could have with a single decision, as we saw with one recent client who embarked on a bold venture in the rest of Africa, invested a few $1 billion there, and again, had to come home licking their wounds. The implications are so severe compared to the decision making of let's say, a single person at a slightly more junior level in the organization. And then the second bit of interest we're getting is from people who have consulting practices, management consultants, coaches, leadership advisors, strategy consultants, people who are interested in finding something they could offer their clients that adds an additional bit of leadership insight into the work they're doing. The reality, of course, is that we're certainly not arguing that only senior people have a worldview and mindset. Everyone has it. But the implications are so much more significant if you get this wrong at the more senior levels. And we can see what this means when you get it wrong for society and the planet.
Absolutely. I think coming back to that profiling or testing, it's always a question. Like I said, I use various tools, and it's always a question for that delegates go through and ask is, well, if I do this test next week, is it going to throw out a different result in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, whatever it might be? And again, certain tests you can literally do it in 10 minutes' time, and it'll be completely different. From a growth perspective, and obviously there hasn't been that much amount of time that it's been in the market. Do you foresee, or is that potentially a hope that the baseline of this is my worldview? Is there a measurement in terms of going, if I do this test in 5 years' time, I would see a change because of the work I've done on myself to open myself up to other understanding? Is that sort of part of the idea, the hope?
Yeah, and Andrew, it is, and the reason for that is because we have this utterly non-judgmental approach to this. We try to define these constructs in a neutral way. Because of that, the mindset really should respond to the context.
Right.
So to give you an example, if in some Middle Eastern regions, for example, it actually makes sense for there to be, and we can debate this, but it makes sense for there to be a leniency towards, let's say, as an example, a benevolent autocracy versus a perfect democracy.
Yeah.
For the history, the mindset of the population, the needs they have, where the country is in its own life cycle, you may say, well, actually, this is not entirely misplaced, and it may challenge your own belief system. But for the context, you might say, this is perfectly suitable. So if you arrive, for example, in a place like that, with an extremist, let's say, democracy mindset, you might find yourself in a serious difficulty.
Yeah.
And you'll grapple to make sense of the environment, and you will communicate, engage with stakeholders on this extremist view of yours, when in fact a completely different mindset runs the day, and by the way, very successfully. So in that sense, that's an interesting example of an expat going into an environment where the mindset may be slightly different, and then appreciating perhaps that a modified version of that mindset may be more suitable to the environment. Having said that, the expat leaves that environment and goes to let's say, a hyper-democratic environment. It's now perhaps more suitable to shift again. So our view is that it's difficult to shift mindset. But in response to your question, the challenge there for leaders is to have some fluidity in that mindset, which is an extremely difficult thing to achieve because, of course, paradigms, patterns of thought are laid down over time.
Yeah.
So the idea is to have a fluid mindset that responds to the context, not to surrender your own mindset, but to allow that to be, as we say in the Mindset Index instrument, compatible and complementary to the mindset that you need to engage with.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, coming from the sort of the learning and development element, it was always a conscious discussion and argument from an HR perspective, specifically around recruitment, of do we go a fully scientific route through a psychometric testing, or do we go just the skill of the recruiter and the gut instinct of getting the right person for the right role? And a number of companies that I've worked in have sort of swung from one to the other, and eventually it literally needs to middle out, going, well, I need the skill of the recruiter to have that gut experience, but also using a bit of science in it. And obviously coming from a psychometric background like you have, majority of your personality profilings and all of that cannot be used in a workspace specifically for recruitment. With this, am I seeing an opportunity where you could strategically, as a CEO, go, we are opening up a branch in Mauritius. This is sort of the profile and the worldview of that location, or it could be anywhere, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, wherever it might be, and aligning then a person with a similar sort of worldview to be able to head that operation up, for example. Is that okay?
Exactly correct. It's one of the applications that, in fact, I didn't see when we came up with this originally, that people are using it very much as a matching instrument for their talent profiling. And again, I want to say we took a great amount of care to have not one, but 24 of these constructs. So I just want to make the point that, of course, a mindset is a subtle and fluid notion. You and I may agree on one of the 24 and vastly disagree on 23 others. So really it is about the combination of factors in the mindset index that provides a profile that is, again, complementary to and compatible with the mindset that you'd find there. So it doesn't have to be a perfect match. We don't want to produce kind of mini-me's. And we all understand, of course, from leadership research that you need a what we call in complexity theory, multiple partial views. That's an important dimension. But as long as using the mindset index, you can see a degree of compatibility and complementarity, then we would say that increases the probability of a successful appointment, especially at a senior level. Again, we've seen this many times, Andrew. You've seen it as many times as I have. Fly in the expat. The person did very well in the country of origin. Fly in the expat, this person brings even their own teams with them very often. And after that launch I described, we get into the operations, decisions are made very much in the way that they were made elsewhere, with no appreciation of this local mindset. So I have to say there's a commercial application to this, but to be brutally honest, I was in the ideal world working towards an instrument, and this is going to sound terribly soppy, for improving global mutual understanding, a way for us to map mindsets in an appreciative, non-judgmental, as I said, non-judgmental way that says, could I learn something about the mindset of another group, another region? You look at the South African context and you look at the contestation in South Africa. You look at issues, the history of our country. You look at issues like Marikana. You look at the fact that, the behaviors of certain leaders in certain contexts, and you think, how is this possible? Think about state capture and a number of other things. And so I was really curious about producing something that senior people who make highly impactful decisions that can change the direction of a country or a multi-billion-dollar company, an instrument that these leaders could have that helps them to have an appreciation for different mindsets. So they're not driving blind from that leadership position.
Something that's, and with any sort of coaching, any sort of leadership development, I suppose it takes an open mind to be able to actually go, this is the problem, or let me get an understanding of the climate. This is where I am. This is where my business is at. This is where my team is at. The likelihood of somebody who is completely closed off to any sort of development or any sort of awareness is not going to be necessarily your target leader. It really is to be able to open up a conversation as to interrogate as an individual, look in the mirror and go, this is who I reflect, and how do I perhaps then go from that space? How are those perhaps those worldviews holding me back in certain areas? And then having the intestinal fortitude to sort of interrogate those viewpoints and go, okay, well, maybe I am wrong. Maybe there is a different way of doing things. And I think, to your point, that's massively important in the world, in business, across culturally, whatever that might be. Question as to how do people access this? How do they get hold of you? How do they get in touch? What is sort of the steps that they would need to take?
It's really quite simple. They go to mindsetindex.com and there they are. They can find whatever they need there. And you simply, you can ask for more information, or you can simply have the assessment done. It is a commercial instrument. We did invest an enormous amount, frankly, of money and time and energy over many years. In fact, this started its development around the World Cup in South Africa.
Right.
I had just finished my PhD, and suddenly we had these different mindsets descending on South Africa from all parts of the world. And I thought, my word, how would people perceive what's going on here? This is really where the birth was of this instrument. And ever since then, there's been huge amount of research done and putting the technology behind it. So it is a commercial instrument. There is a price to it. I would say for senior people in large organizations, one thing to consider perhaps is, let's have a look at some of the mistakes in your enterprise in the last 3 years. What's the average cost of a mistake?
Yeah.
And if you can overcome some of that, diminish some of that risk, or sense some of the opportunity earlier with an instrument like this, I think that's one way to think about the price. So yeah, mindsetindex.com, simple as that.
Awesome. So all the links will be down the bottom. Dr. Morne, it's been fantastic again. It's so interesting in terms of what you've been doing, and I'm really excited to have a look at the instrument, and hopefully use it with some of my clients. Definitely, we'll put that into the sphere and into the universe. But it's really great to see you. Like I said when we first were off air, you're looking fantastic, and it's yeah, all the best with this endeavor, and again, all the best in terms of your new role in planning the presidency. Hopefully, we'll have to catch up again at some point. But again, I want to thank you for your openness and your authenticity in everything that you do. So it's been great to catch up with you again. All the best, and yeah, definitely, hopefully, see you soon again.
Andrew, thank you so much, and thanks for this work that you do also, to really expose new ideas such as this, an African invention created here in South African innovation, and bringing that to the attention of people. I'll end perhaps with the notion that it was Churchill, I think, speaking in times of war. Well, here we are again with Russia, Ukraine. Speaking in times of war, Churchill argued the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. And in this way, Churchill was really signaling the importance of mindset for decisions that have vast implications for our society. And Mindset Index hopes to respond to this. It's been fantastic chatting to you again. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.